And action. Live from New York, it's Show and Tell.
Take 7.
You want another one?
No, I think it's good.
All right.
As the man said, this is Show and Tell. My theme is always vintage knitting, but there's also this little Hollywood twist. And today, boy, are we going Hollywood. That's why I tried to give you a little Hollywood glamour thing going here. Trying. My guest today is Krista. She's a professional knitter who knits for film and television. And in a moment, I'll be back with her. She's going to give us the inside scoop on how she managed to get the best knitting gig in the world. Be right back. Okay, so here is my guest for today, Krista. There's so little that I know about her. I'm probably going to ask her to introduce herself, but let me just preface this by saying my next episode is going to be about sweaters in the movies and Hollywood stars wearing sweaters. So I thought before we get into that, it would be very appropriate to do an episode featuring somebody who has actually knit for Hollywood. That's about all I know. I know that Krista has a blog, which is how I found her when I was doing my research for my next episode. But I'm just going to ask you to, take it from there. Oh, by the way, people who watch me know this is not my usual getup. This is my rendition of maybe 1950s Hollywood, like a Grace Kelly kind of thing here. To catch a thief, I'm driving in Monaco in a Jaguar. Anyway, sorry to digress. Tell me how you got into this, and has this been your lifelong profession, or did you segue from something else? Because I'm interested in knowing, and I assume other people are going to be interested in knowing as well.
Yeah, it was definitely not something that I had ever planned on doing. I moved to Los Angeles after I graduated from high school and ended up being there for about 20 years. And just kind of, you can't live in like Hollywood, Los Angeles without living in Hollywood, Los Angeles. And, dealing with paparazzi and everybody's in the business and stuff. And it wasn't something I'd ever planned to do. I was actually a music publicist when I first moved out there. And because I always loved live music and bands and things like that, and decided that I didn't like musicians. I did marry one, and all of our friends are musicians. So I guess some musicians I didn't like. But I kind of got a little bit of a taste of Hollywood and sort of all of that. And honestly, I wasn't really that into it. It was one of those things where it was kind of cool when I was in my 20s, but as I got older, like it just kind of got, a little less exciting. And, so I actually went back to school to become a teacher. And I got my teaching credential and became a credentialed elementary school teacher and went into teaching for a little bit. And I started knitting at about that time. A girlfriend and I were riding our bikes one morning, and she's like, I want to learn how to knit. And I'm like, oh, that sounds like fun. And so we took some classes together. At the time, I was with my then boyfriend, now husband, and he was like, he remembers the alarm going off at like 10 a.m. I'm not a morning person. And so I would get up and go to these knitting classes and learned how to knit, really got sucked into it, and then just started knitting, and it helped me survive college. I love learning, but I really struggle with early morning classes. And it was only like a 20-minute drive to the campus, but then it took me an hour to find parking. So I ended up just taking the bus. And so I would knit on the bus and I would knit during class because I have a tough time. Growing up, we weren't allowed to just sit and watch TV. I love movies. I love TV. I love all that stuff, but we weren't allowed to just sit and zone watch TV. I had to be doing something. Mm-hmm. So I was coloring or playing with Legos or something like that. And so even as an adult, it was hard for me to focus. And I think that was a reason I had a tough time at college at first. When I first went at like 18, 19. And so when I was about 23, 24, and I went back, I just started knitting, and I was able to knit through class, and I was able to focus, and it really helped me survive college. And I don't know, I just kind of started to really get into it. I loved it. And then I got into teaching kids knitting. And then I was a school teacher for a while. And then it just sort of became this thing where I was like, I really love knitting and I really love teaching knitting. And so they kind of morphed into this one career that I hadn't expected. But the problem is you don't make a lot of money teaching knitting, and you definitely don't make a lot of money just knitting. And so I sort of found a way to morph these two loves together of teaching and knitting, but neither of them pay very much money. And so I started thinking about like costume designers, and it wasn't something that really consciously came to me. It was more one of those things where a friend sent me a message and he had seen a posting on Craigslist for somebody looking for a knitter for a project. Long story short, it ended up being for Hunger Games, and I befriended this person who was a machine knitter. And so then she needed some stuff hand knit. Nothing ever made it into the movie, unfortunately. But I started to learn about this idea of like costume designers need knitters. And so there was a convention that came to town, and it was like called like Fashionista or Fashion Con or something like that. Not my thing at all, at all. But it had a panel of costume designers in one of the panels. It was mostly for people who wanted to be like stylists in Hollywood. And but there was one panel for costume designers. And I said, okay, it was like $350 to go, which at the time was a lot of money for me. I mean, it's still a lot of money, but I decided I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pay this money to go to this one panel, but I'm going to get my business card in each of their hands. And one of them ended up being Salvador Perez, who is the costume designer for the Mindy Project. And because of my years of background in PR, I kind of knew how to follow up without being like annoying. So every 3 months, I just put in my calendar to just drop an email to him and say, hey, just checking in, see if you need anything. A year went by with no response. And I was going to send one last email at the 1 year mark. And he emailed me back immediately and said, hey, yeah, I want to talk to you about some Mindy stuff. When can you come by the studio? And so I ended up meeting up with him. He's such an amazing person. He's so talented. I just absolutely love him. And so he was the first costume designer that I got to work with, and started doing pieces for Mindy Kaling for the Mindy Project. And then it kind of just snowballed from there. He's the president of the CDGA, which is the Costume Designers Guild Association. And so he was so supportive in posting on Instagram about me, and then other costume designers started following me. And I kind of just got this reputation for being a very fast knitter that can produce pieces that fit the actors and the measurements that they give me, because I can't ever go to fittings. Like, I don't go to fittings. I just get measurements. And so it kind of just snowballed from there. And after about 20 years of living in Los Angeles and sort of building up that reputation, we decided we wanted to leave. And that's when we kind of hit the road to travel. And now I just get kind of random emails or phone calls or texts from costume designers either I've never worked with before, or that I know we follow each other on Instagram, and then they needed something. And it just kind of snowballed into that. So did I plan it? No. Is it something that sort of organically came that I'm like loving? Yes, absolutely.
It's one of the most amazing stories. Everyone watching this show most likely loves to knit. And I think everybody watching would probably like to knit for money if it paid well enough. Mm-hmm. You have a very unique and very special gig. I would imagine, tell me if I'm wrong, that in LA, knitting is not a big popular thing because it's always warm there. So, you're more limited. I don't imagine people wanting to wear a lot of sweaters or taking up knitting there as a hobby. So if that's correct, that premise, then the people in Hollywood are going to have a harder time finding knitters out there than they would if they were here in New York. Because in New York, probably a lot more people knit because we have sweater weather. Mm-hmm. A lot. Yeah. So you were probably in the right place at the right time, and you had a particular skill. I wanted to ask you to just roll back a little bit about teaching children, because I learned to knit as a child. Mm-hmm. My mommy taught me. I was 4 years old. How did you teach these children to knit? You did not teach them continental, did you? You taught them to sew?
Yeah, it's funny because I teach pretty much anybody to knit in sort of the same way, no matter what age they are. The first thing I ask them is, are they right-handed or left-handed? And then I say, just so you know, it doesn't matter. I'm actually right-handed, but I knit continental. And so I will put the needles in their hands and see what hand they want to grab the yarn with. Sometimes it's right, sometimes it's left. And then I work with them on that from there, because there's definitely if you're right-handed, you knit English, and if you're left-handed, you knit continental, because I am right-handed, but I still knit continental. And so I just put it into their hands and let them see what is comfortable for them. And then I sort of show them both ways, and then they gravitate to one or the other.
I'm right-handed.
Mm-hmm.
I knit continental.
Exactly.
But I wasn't taught to knit continental as a child. I believe that teaching somebody very young, it's easier to throw. But I wasn't much older than 4 when somebody got a hold of me, one of my mother's close friends, and she said, let me teach you a different way that's faster.
Right.
She teased me. She said, you're knitting like an old lady. Let me show you the modern way to knit.
Right.
So I've been knitting continental since I'm probably about 5, maybe 5.5. And it's great to be able to do both if you're doing color work.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's see what else. So you mentioned this nomadic life that, after 20 years of doing this, you decided you wanted to hit the road. What was your first foray out of LA? And then I definitely want to get into talking about your travels with you, because I also love to travel. And I've been traveling. I'm a lot older than you are. I've been traveling a lot longer than you. So I want to compare notes. I want to know where on the map you've been and where I haven't been. Because you're working on 7 continents now, right?
Yes, I've already this year been to 6 continents. My last one is
in
Australia.
a single year.
This year, I've already been to 6 continents.
Okay. In my whole life, I never met anybody who could make that claim.
I kind of wish I had gone to Australia last month, because then I would have hit all 7 continents within a 4-month span. Yeah, it just kind of worked out that way, because I had trips planned out, but they all got smushed together into 1 year. And so that's why they kind of all ended up in 1 year.
I was just going to say, in New York, we have a private club called the Explorers Club. I don't know if you've heard of it. I don't know what their membership requirements are, but I would have to guess that you qualify. Because I don't know too many people other than my father and his wife who have been on all 7 continents. It's a pretty large claim to be able to make. So kudos to you. And then to do it all in such a short time span. Yeah, I want to know how that happened. This is knitting related, or it's just we want to travel and see the world?
So I love photography. That's kind of a hobby of mine. And I basically knit to do photography, to travel. That's my reason for knitting. And because it pays for that. And so I had already had a trip to Tanzania, Egypt, and Jordan planned, but they were supposed to have happened last year, I think. And they got pushed to this year. And then I found out at the end, October of last year, that I could get on a trip to Antarctica, and with a pre-trip in Patagonia, so in Argentina. And so I was like, okay, well, that's 3 and 2. That's already 5 continents, because Jordan is technically Asia, which a lot of people don't know, but Jordan is Asia. So I did a trip to Patagonia and spent about a week and a half in Argentina. So there's South America. Then we did the Drake's Passage down to Antarctica. So there's the White Continent. And then to go to Tanzania, we went, so that was Africa between Tanzania and Egypt. And then Jordan is Asia. And then on the way back, we spent about 7 or 8 days in Amsterdam. So there's Europe. So there was 5. And of course, I live in North America. So there's 6. And then, so the last one is Australia. And so I'm doing a trip with some of my photography girlfriends in November to go to Australia. And all 3 of us are going to check the 7th continent off.
That's just simply amazing.
It just worked out that way.
So of the places you've mentioned so far, I have not been to Jordan. I have not been to Patagonia. I have been in South America. I was in Brazil.
Mhm.
Asia, yes, Philippines and Hong Kong, and also Istanbul because it spans Asia and Europe.
Mhm.
We honeymooned in Turkey, my
Oh,
husband
nice.
and I. He has ancestry there, and it was someplace that neither of us had been. It was a little bit difficult to find someplace that neither of us had been. And I thought for a honeymoon, it should be something very special. So we did
Mhm.
that. Tanzania and Egypt I've been to. What's your favorite place so far that you have visited?
You know, Tanzania just holds a special place in my heart. That's my third time. This year was our third time going there. And both my husband and I are just in love with that country and the people. And I love wildlife photography. And so, yeah, definitely Tanzania.
Well, that is a big surprise. My dad also was an avid photographer. Oh, someday on the show, I should pull out some of his photos and show some things. And of course, they had been in Africa and Ngorongoro Crater and
Yes.
Lake Manyara, where
Manyara,
lions climb the trees. My dad became famous in his camera clubs and in his inner circle for a photograph of a lion in a tree, just really a lioness, you know, without the whole mane thing.
Mhm.
Just dangling there very casually, like watching the world pass by. Oh, it's such a wonderful, wonderful story. So tell us about some of the projects that you've worked on. What are, you know, some big name things? You mentioned a couple already, but
Yeah, I always get just like super random calls. And it's always for like a little one piece here or there. I did quite a few pieces for the Mindy Project. I did at least 20. And that was a really amazing process. Mindy Kaling is phenomenal. Sal, the costume designer, he's amazing. So that one has my heart because it was my first project. And I also had so much fun because he was like, I just want bright colors and I want it to be clashy and colorful and fun patterns, which was good for me because I love that stuff. I don't wear it, but I love to knit with it. And so that was definitely a big one. And then I've done a few like small TV stuff, like a couple pieces on Lucifer and iCarly. I did a sweater in the movie Annabelle Comes Home, which was actually a replica of a vintage piece they had in the archives. And it was kind of falling apart and they needed it to fit their actress and not fall apart.
what does it look like? Because we're vintage oriented, the show.
Right. Yeah, it's she wears it through a very large chunk of the movie. It's a marbled blue and white sweater with tulips on the front. And so I can send you a picture to drop in. But that is sometimes what I do is they send me a piece that is either vintage or doesn't fit the actor. And then I replicate it to the measurements of the actor. And so that was a fun piece. I hate horror movies. Like I used to love them, but I can't, like I get nightmares. And so I watched that movie. And then once she took the sweater off, that's like when she put her pajamas on and all the scariness happens. And I'm like, all right, I'm done. I left, but I got to see my sweater in it. But yeah, so that's also one of the things that I sort of end up doing is they'll send me older pieces that need to be replicated. And I've gotten very good at doing that, matching yarns, matching colors, resizing things and stuff like that.
Boy, could I use you on some of my own projects. In the episode that I just posted today, I showed a pair of brown suede shoes that are vintage reproduction, and I wanted to match the brown. I looked at hundreds and hundreds of browns. And finally, I settled on one. It's a 3-color sweater that I'm knitting. So I needed brown. And then the shoe has some little stripes, sort of like a plaid stitching in it. And I wanted to pick up a couple of the other colors. So to get brown and 2 other colors from the shoe was really challenging.
Yep.
Are some colors harder? Like is brown one of the harder colors?
Yes, brown is definitely a harder color. Blue and green are the hardest, I find, for the reason that, you know, I can't go to 40 different yarn stores and look at all of their blues and greens. I have to rely some on my knowledge of what the colors look like and pictures on a computer. And blue and green do not photograph well. And so that's a tough one. And then of course, sending pictures of the swatches, if I'm on a short deadline and I can't physically send a swatch to a costume designer, I have to send pictures. And that's really hard because my camera photographs them very differently. And so I have to like adjust the picture to, you know, next to the swatch. And then I don't know how their computer is set and stuff. So how they're going to see it. So yes, blues and greens and browns are probably the hardest ones.
Good, then I don't feel so bad.
No.
Actually, the other things that I've tried to match up from a handbag were in the blues and the greens, and I struggled with that a lot.
Yep.
Are there certain companies that you really like to work with because they have a wide array of colors and you know that you can always find what you're looking for?
Yeah, I actually have it's like such a weird thing, but I actually kind of have a bad memory for color. But once I see it, I'm like, okay, I know that is that color from that yarn company. And I know that like companies like Cascade and Barocco definitely have very wide ranges of color. The problem is a lot of times they are wanting colors to look very natural. And what that means in the knitting world is it needs to be tonal. So it can't be like a solid dyed something. You know, if you want a sweater that looks like it's, you know, a nice brown cozy from straight off a sheep, you can't get factory dyed yarns because it doesn't have those tonals that the natural fiber would have if it did just come off a sheep. And so I do a lot of blending. Sometimes I'll get thinner yarns and blend them to create that tonal look, so that it has that dimensional color, but it's not all one solid. So I do a lot of blending, but yeah, I mean, you just kind of get to know. I also have met some yarn dyers who can dye to Pantone colors, or I can send them a swatch and they can dye to. The biggest issue with that is time. It depends on how much time I have. And then another thing that happens is sometimes the costume designer will send their PA to a local yarn store where they're filming with the physical piece, and they will go and then send me the yarn, which I love because then I don't have to be in charge of picking out colors.
Right.
But then they'll send me the yarn and then I'll just knit up the piece. So I like that. That's my favorite because then I don't have to worry about colors.
Well, you raise a very interesting point about Pantone colors. That's a standard. It's, what is it, red, green, blue, and there's certain numbers assigned to it.
Correct.
Why isn't that the industry standard in the yarn world, that every color gets assigned a Pantone number so that it's the same every time out? I mean, I'm not talking about hand dyeing. I'm talking about commercially dyed yarn.
Right.
Like,
I don't think
I've had to return yarn because, you know, it looked on my screen completely different. Like I thought I was getting pumpkin and I got this bright orange, like trick or treat, that I didn't want.
Yeah.
So,
I think that would be a really amazing thing. I know that yarn is starting to come into this world of it being like true, very smart thing for them to do. I think the biggest issue you have is every fiber takes dye differently. So if you have a Pantone, you know, E50432 in an alpaca, it's still going to look different if it's in a silk or a wool or a cotton or a linen. And so I think that it's a great idea, but there are so many things that change fiber. You know, what's going to end up looking like in the end.
that's probably why it's not done that way. There's one company that their color chart is true colors. So they photographed it to match the color of the yarn. So if you get that brochure, you know what the colors are. And it's commercial, so it's consistently, you know, the colors. I haven't knit with them, but Roxanne Richardson, who's a big name in the knitting community, uses them. I forget what they're called, but I'll put the name in the notes or put the name in here, something like Brown Valley Sheep, I don't know, something like that. But they're an American manufacturer. So
Mhm.
that might be
Yeah.
helpful to you, actually.
Yeah.
Then what you see is what you get. You just buy their card and then you'll know the colors, and they have a big array. And I think that they do have some very natural colors in there.
Mhm.
So for whatever that's worth.
Yeah. Yeah. I would love for things to be a little bit more, I mean, for my job, it would be easier for sure to be able to know, you know, I know I'm ordering this color. This is what it looks like on the screen. This is what it's going to look like.
Right.
But, you know, then you have dyeing companies that you order one color and then you get it in a different lot and it's almost a completely different color. And so that's a whole nother thing. That's indie dyed though. And I do think that dyers are starting to realize that that's, you know, they really have to work their formulas out, because knitters want to be able to buy the same thing. If they see their friend has this beautiful yarn and they love it and they order it and it's a lot more green than theirs was, it's like, okay, well, that's not the color I ordered. So it's all a science, and it's certainly not something I tried dyeing like once. I bought like the lobster pot and the dyes and stuff, and I didn't like it at all. I didn't like standing over a hot pot. So I love what dyers are doing, and I can't imagine how hard that is to recreate, because there's also a lot of things in dyeing that I know adjust and change what the yarn looks like. It could be a higher alkaline in their water. You know, there's a lot of things in the water that can change what dye looks like. And so there's some stuff even they don't have control over.
So let's get back to your sweaters. Do you have any sweaters where you are that you can show us, or only photographs?
No, I don't keep anything. Unfortunately, I mean, when you live in a 26-foot RV, your storage is very limited. And so I don't carry any stuff with me. I literally get the yarn, I make the piece and I send it off. And I even send any extra yarn that I have, because if they need to make mends or repairs or anything like that, they have it. But so I don't hold on to anything that I make for stuff like that. I love to just, I'm a process knitter. I think people are either process knitters or product knitters. And as you said, in Los Angeles, there are actually quite a few knitters in Los Angeles, but we either make stuff as gifts, or like, you know, some people will make things for the cooler evenings in the winter. It does get a little bit chilly in the evenings during the winter and stuff. We don't have like big bulky sweaters and things like that.
No, but people do travel. I mean, people go to the mountains and
right,
ski,
exactly.
or they go to the desert where it's cooler.
Right. But I'm a process knitter. I love the process of it. I could care less about keeping the product. I send it off. It's a gift. It's sent to the manufacturer. It's sent to, you know, the yarn dyer, whoever. I'll knit it and then I just send it off. So I don't keep anything.
And you knit nothing for yourself? No time?
I mean, I have a couple of hats, but I don't pay myself to knit. So I tend, if I have anything for myself, it's because it's a design for my Learn with Knitsy Academy, what I teach and stuff. And so anything that I have for myself is that. And what's funny is I had knit my husband a sweater years ago, like when I first started knitting. And I put like, he's a musician, so I put like drop stitches in it, and he took it to work, and it was at work for 8 years. Don't ask me if it got cleaned. I don't know. I never saw it. And when he left that job, he brought it home and I saw it, and it was hideous. It was pilling. It had like these really tight bind offs so it was like causing this droopy, like drapey. It was so ugly. And I was so embarrassed. I'm like, you tell people that I knit that? Like, it looks terrible. He's like, people love it. I'm like, oh, so I made him get rid of it. And I told him, I'm like, I promise I'll knit you another sweater. That was like 10 years ago. He still gives me crap. He's like, where's my sweater? I'm like, honey, you can't afford me anymore.
So it's like the shoemaker's children.
Yeah.
No shoes, no sweaters.
Yeah. So I do need to make him a sweater, but I just, you know, I'm busy. I've got other stuff I got to knit and get sent off.
What's the most complicated thing you've had to knit?
Oh man. I think the hardest things that end up being having to knit are when there are so many restrictions on what I have to knit, as far as it fitting a very specific person, if they have any kind of fiber allergies. But I think I'm trying to think of like what would be the challenge that I like just nearly killed me. I wouldn't say that it was complicated in technique, but I had to knit for a fashion designer some very large bean bags. And so in Los Angeles in August, knitting a beanbag out of Cascade Magnum yarn using like 18 skeins of it. That was very difficult to knit because it was so heavy on the needles. And what I did is I bought a beanbag from like Wayfair or something, and then I knit the cover and then knit around it and closed it up inside. That was very physically difficult on my hands. And but as far as like techniques and stuff, I don't know if I can think of anything that was like a really big, like horrific challenge. Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of times it's just, you know, the thing about knitting is when you've done enough knitting, you can dissect a sweater. Like I'm sure you've probably done this, standing in line at the shopping, you know, at the grocery store, and somebody in front of you has this beautiful knit sweater on, and you sit there and go, okay, well, that's a 4x4 cable. That's a little bit of moss stitch. And then they got a honeycomb there. And like, do you sort of like start making notes on your phone of like what their sweater is? Because I love seeing all that, and I can dissect it. I can look at it and I can go, okay, that's what that all is. And that's 90% of what my job is just dissecting a project or a drawing. You know, like they'll send me a sketch, and then I have to, and like they'll send me a sketch, the measurements, and then a picture from online of like a stitch pattern. And then I have to put all three of those together. And the hardest part of that is just making sure that the stitch pattern fits within the math of it.
So the shapes are usually basic. There's no complicated, like a piece that's going over the shoulder and around and up and down and back around the waist or some, you know, nothing that's bizarre like that. Everything is kind of like standard.
I mean, man, that's a really good question. I hadn't really thought about that. No. Oh, okay. So yeah. Okay. The hardest part is not being able to try it on somebody. I did just recently, like last year, I did a piece for iCarly. And I actually haven't seen the piece, but it was how do I describe this? It was like a shell neck tank top, right? But it had a fully open shoulder, and then the sleeve came down from here. And so it was only very lightly connected under the arm.
Mm.
And that was very difficult because I was working off of drawings and then pictures of factory made ones. That was very difficult because I didn't have anybody to try it on. I'd never done a sleeve like that. I don't know how that type of sleeve drapes. And so that was a very difficult one. You know, doing a cold shoulder sweater is not that big of a deal, but it was fully open, and it was only connected by about a strip of fabric about an inch wide and about, I don't know, 4 inches long under the arm. And that was the only way it was connected. And I'm like, I don't know how these sleeves are going to drape. Luckily, they wanted super slouchy sleeves, so it was better for it to be, you know, drapier than not. But that was a very difficult piece because I had just never made anything like that. So I need to see how that turned out. They loved it. They said it's amazing, and they were going to send pictures. I hadn't seen it yet. So I'll have to reach out and see if I can find that piece.
Getting back to what you said, eyeing people. I was in the Metropolitan Museum many years ago, and I saw a woman wearing a store-bought sweater that I thought was so interesting. I kept sneaking pictures with my phone. And when I look at those pictures, I cannot figure out the ribbing was going like on the bias and then in other directions. And it must have been a very unusual construction. It wasn't just straight up ribbing.
Right.
It wasn't brioche. I don't know what it was, but it was very, very smart looking. Right now, I have a sweater that my son bought. The nerve of him to buy a sweater when his mother's a knitter, but I think he didn't pay a lot of money for it. And I thought it was cotton, but now that I've washed it for him, I see it's 100% wool. And it's like an Aran sweater. It zips up the front, and it's got a lot of interesting stuff. I don't do a lot with cables. I'm more a color work person. And just so you know who you're dealing with here, size 1 needles, 42 stitches to 4 inches, sterile.
Yep.
It took 4.5 months of knitting it every single day.
Yep.
I'm retired, so I'm not dividing my time between an office and knitting. I was able to knit on that every day,
Mm-hmm.
4.5 months.
Wow.
But
But
it's gorgeous.
that's the thing is it's not just a sweater, it's a work of art. And I think that's one thing that like really I would like to see the mainstream world look at knitting as not just being a handicraft that old ladies do, because that is just such the stigma. It is an art form, and it takes crazy talent. I mean, you tell a non-knitter, 42 stitches to 4 inches, and they're just like, that doesn't mean anything to me. You tell a knitter, and you're automatically calculating the number of hours, hundreds of hours, and like it's so highly appreciated. And that's why I think costume designers have really started getting into working with knitters, because they understand. They know if they're going to make a sweater or a dress, when you have to buy the fabric, you have to cut it out, you have to pattern it, all these things. And so I think that they're starting to understand the importance of it. And knitters we know how awesome what we do is. It's something that you can't do for anybody else. You have to do it because you love it, because you appreciate it.
What's your typical needle size that you're working on?
It is all over the place. All of the Mindy pieces, which were skirts and vests and everything, those were all size 2. And I'm a tight knitter. Yeah. So that would be like a size 1 probably for most people. But there's some projects that I'm on slightly larger needles, but the beanbag stuff, that was like a size, 17. I work all range for sure.
Wow. I wasn't expecting you to say size 2, because that's going to take.
Yeah. All the Mindy stuff was size 2. Yeah.
You'll send me some pictures that I can insert
Absolutely.
here. Great.
Mm-hmm.
So before I let you go, tell the people what your blog is, because I'm sure they're going to want to go and read some of your writings, and any other social media that you want people to find you on.
Sure. So my blog is explorewithknitsy, and I'm not super great at blogging because that requires putting the knitting down to pick up the computer. But I do have some articles on there about like what it takes to knit for Hollywood, like sort of the things you have to think about. I got a couple articles about that and some free patterns and things like that. I also have a academy called Learn with Knitsy Academy, and it's a online school, and I teach a lot of through projects. I teach a lot of finishing techniques, because that's one of the things when you knit for something that has to go on screen. It has to have really solid finishing, perfect seams, weave in the tails perfectly, all those finishing techniques. And so I sort of have developed those over the years. And so within the academy, I teach a lot of that stuff. And I also help people with patterns. I love teaching still. And so if you're like working on a project and you're like, hey, I don't understand what this pattern means or anything like that, that's part of the academy. So I have that. And then my Instagram is explorewithknitsy. And that's about it. Those are kind of the places where you can get me. And it's always me, like, sometimes I'll get emails from people and they'll be like, hey, can you tell Krista? And I'm like, this is me. Like, I don't have people working for me. So if you reach out to me, you'll hear from me. That's who I respond to. So yeah, I'm just available wherever. And if you want to upgrade your knitting, my academy is a really great place to do that. And travel, I always posting stuff about travel on my Instagram. And yeah, that's it.
One more question. Where's your next trip?
Sure. I actually leave next week to go to Alaska. We've been spending a lot of time in Arizona because of the pandemic and everything at my parents' house. And my in-laws live in Virginia. And so they're coming out and we're going to go spend a couple weeks up in Alaska with both sets of parents and do that. And then we hit the road indefinitely at the end of June back in the RV, now that everything's opened back up. And then my next huge international trip, which I'm really excited about, is I'm going to Norway and then out into the Arctic to photograph the polar bears. So that's exciting.
So just in case you don't know, in Alaska, they sell something called Qiviut.
Qiviut, uh-huh.
I regret not buying some when we were there. I had sticker shock.
It's a lot.
But I probably should have bit the bullet and then...
Yeah, it's the second most expensive yarn. The first is, I remember the name of it, but it's a brand of alpaca, I think, I think it's alpaca in South America. And I can't remember what it's called. I think it starts with an H, but yeah, Qiviut is a delicious yarn for sure.
Well, I went into a couple of shops and I petted it. I wanted to
Yep.
see, why is this $200 for a small
Exactly.
ball? And I felt how soft it was. I don't knit accessories usually. I'm a sweater knitter. So to knit a sweater out of that,
Yeah, you have to sell a kidney or something.
yeah, you can't afford that.
No.
Anyway, someday, maybe.
Maybe. Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe if I start knitting for Hollywood, I can make some.
There you go.
I don't
Yeah.
know, nickels
It's a
and
fun
dimes.
yarn. It's a super cool yarn for sure.
Krista, thank you so much for spending this time with me and answering all my questions. And I shouldn't keep you. You probably have a lot of knitting to do, unless you're knitting right now and I'm not even aware of it.
No, it's next to me, but I'm not working
Ooh.
on it. When I have to really concentrate, then I don't knit. If I was just listening, I'd be knitting.
Thank you again. I'll wait for some pictures for,
Absolutely.
I'll sprinkle them around in here.
Mhm.
Say goodbye.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh.
Bye.
Thank you.
And action. Live from New York, it's show and tell.
Can you do that one again? Is that what you do? First you do action and then live from New York? I did it the opposite
I know.
way. Okay.
And action. Live from New York, it's Saturday night. These are like the bloopers.
Okay, go ahead. Do I have my thing on the right hue? No, there, it's golden. It's good.
And action. Live from New York, it's Saturday night.
Could you do it's show and tell, maybe?
Oh yeah.
It is Saturday night.